Josephine Butler played a crucial role in the parliamentary campaigns to raise the age of consent for girls to 16 in 1885 and to abolish the Contagious Diseases Act in 1886. If these campaigns had failed, we might still be living in a country that provided disease-free, so-called government women to any male citizen wishing to pay for sex, and one that permitted men to assault girls of 13 and over with impunity. I will, of course, give an outline of Butler's ideological opposition to the state regulation of vice, but I also want to make clear my own sense of Butler's significance. Butler single-handedly transformed the territory into which Victorian feminism had so far ventured. Firstly, in terms of the controversial nature of the topic, female sexuality, at a time when sexual purity or chastity was demanded of middle-class women. And secondly, in terms of the social type of women on whose behalf she campaigned, the poor and uneducated working and underclass. Prior to her taking up the leadership of the Ladies' National Association that campaigned for the abolition of the Contagious Diseases Act, Butler was what we might think of as a typical late Victorian middle-class feminist. Frustrated at the lack of educational and vocational opportunities afforded her class, frustrated at Parliament's recent failure to reform divorce law on behalf of abused wives, that was in 1857. Single-issue protests, which all came together under the umbrella of the woman question, all of which rested upon women's claim to equality with men, and thus served the interests of an articulate minority. Equal rights to university education, to teach training, qualifications and salaries, the rights of married women to their own earnings and property, and ultimately women's right to vote. This latter campaign, energised by the passing of the Second Reform Act in 1867, which had extended the suffrage to most middle-class men. Butler was involved to a greater or lesser degree in each of these respectable feminist causes. She signed petitions for suffrage, for married women's property rights. She was influential, I think I'll take my jacket off. She was influential in setting up the university extension scheme to give female students at least access to higher education, which led eventually to the setting up of Girton College and Newnham College in Cambridge in the 1870s. But in December 1869, she stepped aside from all of these causes in order to head, as I say, the newly formed Ladies' National Association, knowing that the rights of middle-class women would be safe in the hands of her fellow reformers, the likes of Elizabeth Wolstenholme-Elmy, Frances Power-Cobb, Barbara Beaudeschamps, Anne Clough, and later Millicent Fawcett and the Pankhursts. To quote Butler herself, "The regulation of vice, the enslavement of the women of the people in its most horrible form, was in full operation, while we were trying to elevate women in the higher or happier ranks, and rightly so, by seeking for them equal educational advantages with men. There were many, I believe, who would continue the educational work, but comparatively few who would care to go down to the deeper and more hidden work, and to encounter the special difficulties, the disgust and the sorrow which met us there. We might say that it was the city of Liverpool that transformed Butler into one of the leading feminist thinkers and political reformers of the late 19th century. She did, of course, claim the authority to speak and act publicly from her evangelical Christian faith and from her own father's role in the anti-slavery movement. But it was Butler's day-to-day experience of seeking out sick and dying prostitutes in the dockyard slums of Liverpool, or in the infirmary of the Brownlow Hill workhouse, that took her out of the home, out of her domestic and correctly feminine sphere of influence, in order to expose the sexual double standard that underpinned the gendered ideology of separate spheres, indeed we might say pretty much all legislation regarding women. The sexual double standard that condoned male promiscuity as natural, but which regarded female moral lapses as unpardonable because unwomanly, unnatural. Liverpool wasn't a naval port, and thus it didn't come under the jurisdiction of the Contagious Diseases Acts, of which I will say more in a moment. But it was, of course, a trading port, and a city whose population was divided between the labouring classes and the moneyed middle class, a class for whom anything could be bought, where human relations were governed by the cash nexus. One consequence of the Industrial Revolution was the increased opportunity for social mobility. Young men entering or aspiring to enter the mercantile middle class increasingly postponed marriage until they could support a family. As the marriageable age of men rose, so did their demand for casual sex with working class women and with prostitutes. And in Liverpool, prostitution was rife. And as Butler would come to appreciate, prostitution was, through and through, an economic issue. There was, as we've seen, considerable demand, but this was met by an ever constant supply of women, priced out of honest labour, work such as millinery or laundressing. And in Liverpool, with no large factories to fall back on, many women took to the streets, often seasonally, temporarily, in order to feed themselves and their families. Butler was not a native of Liverpool, a Northumbrian. She moved to Liverpool in the late 1860s, immediately after the accidental death of her 5-year-old daughter in Cheltenham. Her husband George was subsequently appointed headmaster of Liverpool College, boys' school, which is still going, and their 3 young sons also attended. Thus, finding herself at home alone, grieving, and in an alien city, Butler began seeking out, as she put it, some pain keener than my own. And so she began to rescue girls and women she found on the streets of Liverpool. She began instinctively, housing those she could under her roof, girls who joined the Butler family as daughters and sisters. Undoubtedly there was a psychological aspect to this desire to tend to physically and emotionally broken young women. Butler herself privately admitted as much. But it was through her intimate contact with the city prostitutes, from street walkers to high-class courtesans, and the knowledge she gained of their lives that began to shape Butler's social and economic analysis of the causes of prostitution. When the house could hold no more new inmates, Butler rented 2 buildings nearby. One, a house of rest, as she called it, to more sick and dying women. I should point out, these are not women dying of syphilis, but dying of lung complaints and so on, of the hard life on the streets. And the other was a training home to teach those who were healthy enough domestic skills, so that they could eventually move far away from Liverpool and earn their money as laundresses and needlewomen, or settle down, marry and have children. It was her consequent dealings with the various refuges established for large-scale rescue and reclamation that shaped her commitment to change social attitudes to foreign women. By mid-century, the prevailing view of prostitutes was that they had unsexed themselves. In the words of Dr. William Acton, who'd made a study of prostitution in 1857, his book was in effect a defence of state-regulated prostitution. The prostitute was a woman with half the woman gone. This was at a time when the female body was considered sacred. It was woman's divine purpose to bear children within wedlock. Prostitutes were regarded as having willfully squandered this God-given gift, tempters of innocent men, they prostituted their bodies for their own base gratification, for money to spend on drink or finery, even that they pursued men wantonly, subject to their own vicious sexual desires. Above all, once a woman fell sexually, there was to be no return. Like Dickens some 20 years earlier, Butler strove to reverse popular thinking by addressing fallen women and prostitutes as women still. Invited to address a conference of Manchester businessmen in May 1870, who were interested not so much in the Contagious Diseases Act, but the question of whether it was possible to reclaim, to rehabilitate former prostitutes. She announced that it was more in her line to address 200 prostitutes and debate with them whether it was possible to reclaim a fallen man. And I've got here a longer quotation from that speech that she gave to the men in Manchester, which is quite wonderful. We hear it said, women who sell their persons are already so degraded that even registration for sanitary purposes can degrade them no further. Henceforth, they are to be no longer women, but only bits of numbered, inspected and ticketed human flesh flung by government into the public market. Spend a week with me among these poor women, and then say whether they are not altogether human beings like ourselves, with hearts and consciences. In 1864, the first of 3 acts was introduced by Parliament at the behest of the War Office. The fact that roughly a third of British soldiers and sailors serving during the Crimean War were suffering from various stages of syphilis, or what was rudimentarily referred to as such. There was a great deal of ignorance regarding sexually transmitted diseases. Prompted the War Office to call for the adoption of a style of government regulation already in operation amongst the civil populations of Europe, a system of registering and examining prostitutes known to the police to ensure that they were free of disease. And it was Butler's deeply held feeling that these acts, the terms of the 1864 Act were then extended in 1866 and 69. She felt that this legislation had been introduced by stealth, and that the press had colluded with the government in suppressing accounts of parliamentary debates in order to safeguard the innocence of women readers, and the irony wasn't lost on Butler. These acts and all legislative measures which deal with prostitution have up to this time been devised and set on foot by men alone, without the aid of women. Nay, not only have women been debarred from attempting to deal in any large sense with this evil, but they have been systematically drilled into silence on this topic. Men have demanded of them an affectation, at least, of ignorance on the subject. The history of man's treatment of this fallen class of women is for the most part a history of alternate patronising and punishing. Their best repressive measures have been almost exclusively directed against one sex. They have seldom practically acknowledged the fact that these female sinners have, in every case, male accomplices, and therefore they have failed to put down the evil. As well might you attempt to do away with the slave trade by making it penal to be a slave. When the third Contagious Diseases Act was passed in 1869, various rescue societies and individual reformers decided that a national association had to be formed to call for the repeal of this legislation and to publicise what had taken place and the implications of the acts. And Josephine Butler, because of her work in Liverpool rescuing prostitutes, was asked to become the figurehead, and she was much more than a mere figurehead. She helped to articulate the association's ideological objections to the legislation. They could have simply protested on the grounds of medical efficacy. Various forms of regulation had been trialled before throughout Europe. They had never been proven to reduce the spread of disease and actually increased the amount of prostitution. But they went further than that. It was crucial for Butler that she argued against the acts in terms of their illegality, she would argue, but also in terms of their immorality. I'm not sure if I've got some quotations here. Yes. The legal challenge to the Acts is encapsulated in her very long pamphlet, The Constitution Violated, that she published in 1871. In which she pointed out that women could be arrested on the say-so of a single police officer, brought to a police station, forcibly examined by a police surgeon, put on the police register, and thereafter subject to internal examination every fortnight. At no point in this process was an innocent woman given the opportunity to prove her innocence. If a woman refused to undergo the examination, she was put in prison on a magistrate's order. And Butler argued that if a woman's moral character was to be examined, she at least had the right to a trial by jury. So she spent a long time talking readers through the Magna Carta and insisting upon the rights of women. And I'll just read through these quotations since they're here. So she argued that the Acts mounted an unequal war upon disease against the weaker sex only. At no point did the War Office contemplate the idea of the soldiers and sailors being examined themselves. And even though the Acts just related to 19 garrison towns and naval ports, mostly in the south of England, Butler argued that any male civilian living in those areas was also being guaranteed a clean prostitute by the government of the day. But as well as the legal argument against the Acts, her chief objection was on moral grounds. I'm not sure whether I've got this quotation. One of her other chief objections to the Acts was that the legislation was designed to keep known prostitutes on the police register and for the police to be able to keep them under surveillance for years to come. There was no provision for any woman wishing to leave the police register and cease being a prostitute and start another life. So, in the words of Butler, by such a system, the path of evil is made more easy to our sons and to the whole of the youth of England. Inasmuch as a moral restraint is withdrawn the moment the state recognises and provides convenience for the practice of a vice which it thereby declares to be necessary and vital. Rather than seeking to rescue and rehabilitate prostitutes, the government had enacted measures to further brutalise, in her words, even the most abandoned of women. And furthermore, and I think this is one of her, the boldest things she admitted, the Acts made no distinction between the common prostitute, as she was described in the legislation, and any other degree of sexual immorality. For example, you know, a common law wife. I think this was a sketch that was done not from the life. It's rather romanticised. But it is worth pointing out that in the course of her public speaking tours, Butler did often address meetings of 500 or more working class men, which had never been done before. And the quotation I've got here is much later in the campaign, when in 1883, this is years after the campaign had been launched, the government eventually realised that the legislation was failing in terms of its inability to curb the spread of syphilis, and they agreed to suspend the Acts in 1883. They were finally abolished in 1886. And some of Butler's male colleagues suggested that she should just stay at home and let Parliament debate the suspension of the Acts. She wanted her ladies to be present in the ladies' gallery of the House of Commons to hear these debates about female sexuality. And this was her response to her male colleagues. As long as any woman is obliged to suffer the outrage of examination by a police surgeon, I should be ashamed to speak of the pain to myself of hearing it. So what was at stake? As I say, the final act of 1869 extended the state regulation of prostitution to a total of 19 garrison towns and naval ports. According to the Medical Times, no one would dream of extending its operation to women of a more decent class. But that is exactly what was proposed by a bill that was put forward in 1872, just a few years after the National Association had been founded. Unfortunately, the opposition was such that got shelved. In 1875, Butler mobilised women throughout Europe and helped found the British Continental and General Federation to fight for the abolition of female slavery and the elevation of public morality among men until regulation ceased to exist. Foremost among its resolutions was the principle that all legal guarantees of personal liberty must be equal for the two sexes. So she not only fought against the legislation in this country, she took her battle throughout Europe. And these are some of the wonderful posters. So, for me, the nature of Butler's campaign challenged Victorian conceptions of the feminine ideal. In order to publicise the inequalities of the legislation and mobilise support from men and women of all classes, Butler discussed police rape by speculum on public platforms. She went on tours of universities. She wrote articles in newspapers. She produced, as you've seen, pamphlets, books. the research for which took it into brothels and lock hospitals, as well as libraries. Forgotten feminist? Well, no. But the name of Josephine Butler doesn't take precedence the way it should. And her name will never have the popular currency, I think, of Millicent Fawcett or the Pankhursts. The suffragettes needed to keep their campaign clear of messy issues like prostitution. And Butler's legacy was shelved, so to speak, sacrificed for the bigger prize, political equality. While she lived, Butler's radical position on the state regulation of vice was grossly misunderstood by new recruits to the purity movement, especially members of the newly founded National Vigilance Association. This was a society that was founded on the back of the exposure of the trade in child prostitution and underage virgins in 1885 that led to the passing of the Criminal Law Amendment Act and the raising of the age of consent for girls. But her own ideas were misunderstood by many of these purity societies, who actually began to advocate for greater police powers to suppress prostitution and clear the streets. Perhaps as you're finding with me today, it is quite difficult to articulate exactly what she stood for, and I think it's still difficult, even dangerous, for feminists to identify with, to be identified with prostitutes. Butler died in 1906. One of her grandsons wrote a biography of her in 1954, which did prompt some further biographical interest. But it was appropriately not until the late 1970s and early 80s, with second-wave feminist historians, that her own life and work, and particularly the campaigns run by the Ladies National Association, the parliamentary campaigns, become re-examined. So we have various studies of Victorian feminists, which do include Josephine Butler in a number. Studies by Barbara Kane, Philippa Levine, Nancy Boyd, and then we get major studies into the prostitution campaigns. These two studies by Judith Valkovich, the first on the prostitution campaigns, and the second one that focuses to a large degree on the campaign to raise the age of consent for girls. My own biography, published in 2001, rigorously examined the Principal Butler archives, which of course are here in the University Library, and also the Women's Library in London, which houses hundreds upon hundreds of Butler's letters to her Ladies National Association colleagues, as well as repeal newspapers, posters, petitions, committee meeting minutes, and so on. And this project led in turn to the 5-volume anthology of Butler's published writings and speeches as part of the Rutledge History of Feminism series. And I co-edited these volumes with Dr. Ingrid Sharp at Leeds University. The 5 volumes took in the repeal campaigns in Britain and in India, because after the Contagious Acts were finally abolished in Britain in 1886, it was discovered that the British government in India were continuing with them, arguing that they had special circumstances in India that required regulation. and are, putting together these resources was felt to be beneficial for, American scholars and many Indian feminist scholars as well. And we were able to transcribe many very fragile and often, quite obscure documents. But we simply didn't have the room to cover Butler's work, throughout Europe, and that work was undertaken shortly afterwards by the esteemed historian Anne Summers, who got Liverpool funding to examine Josephine Butler's campaigns in an international perspective. And they also, there was a huge conference at the Women's Library, and she also produced a special edition of Women's History Review. Since my own biography came out, I've also been involved in a couple of other collections of essays that re-examine Butler's perspective from a religious perspective. Sex, Gender and Religion, edited by Jenny Daggers at Liverpool Hope, and then the Church of England put together a symposium which examined Josephine Butler and Anglican social action on prostitution today. Again, thinking about her legacy. And finally, in the last year, Helen Navas has brought out a new biography of Butler. And in 2006, Durham University named its latest residential college after Butler, who, as I say, originated in Northumberland. They do have a tiny archive there, but I'm just mentioning Josephine Butler College because of its lecture and seminar series, which it began in 2007, intended to reflect issues which Josephine Butler, the 19th century rights campaigner, had a direct interest in, or which we believe, it's not very well written, or which we believe, if still alive today, she would have had. These include prostitution, the rights of women, and health. And I'm going to leave it there because you might have your own ideas about what her legacy is, and whether you can think of any particular issues that she would have been working towards today. Thank you.